Absolutely fine at my end, yes. I am ready.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all the participants who have joined in. We'll just wait for a few minutes to start the session. We'll let others also join in. Thank you for joining in today. Hello, everybody. Thank you all for joining in today. It is my immense delight to welcome you to the Global Carbon Market 3-day training organized by the AsiaLeds Partnership. I would especially like to thank the Global Carbon Markets Program at GIZ, who have graciously shared with us the contents for the training program. This particular training has been especially curated for the Asia region with support from colleagues from Verico CSC based out of Germany. Verico members have extensive expertise in the entire and complex topics of climate finance, covering Kyoto Protocol, the clean development mechanism, and the Paris Agreement of the UNFCCC. And they have experience of over 2 decades They've also worked on compliance for carbon markets, for example, an accredited auditor of the EU ETS system and various other voluntary markets. Next slide, please. So for the agenda for today and for the course of the next 3 days is that we will start with the keynote welcome by our very own co-chair of the Finance Working Group of the LEDS GB. This will be followed by a little interactive session that we would like with all our participants to get to know you better, as it's going to be a 3-day long training. And this will be followed by our lead trainer, Mr. Zot Lengyal, who will lead us through all the contents of the training, starting with day 1, where we'll be discussing the basics of carbon pricing. Next slide. The second day, we will be focusing on the international cooperation under Kyoto Protocol, as well as the Paris Agreement, and also have sessions on learning from different cases across the world. So this will be an interesting session that we will have. And on the third day, we will focus on the voluntary carbon markets and kind of look at the design and implementation, both at the domestic as well as the international market stage. Moving on to the housekeeping rules for the 3-day session. Participants will be on mute mode for while the trainer is taking the sessions. However, if you do have any questions during this time, you may raise your hands and we could either unmute you to ask the question directly to the speaker, or if you wish, you can type out your questions in the Q&A box, which you will find the icon for below your screens. We also are delighted to have interpretations in Bahasa, in Vietnamese, and in Chinese for all our participants. We hope that this will not limit you from understanding and imbibing all the information that is given in this training. And you can, of course, ask your questions also in the language that you are familiar with. And our interpreters will do the same and tell us the questions in English as well. We also are going to be having our interactive session on AHA slides. More details of how you can log in to this platform will be given in the slides subsequently. So please keep engaged on this platform, and we will we enjoy being in touch with you and keeping you engaged in this session. So moving on now, I'm delighted to invite to this platform our finance co-chair, Mr. Marlon Appananda. Mr. Marlon Appananda has joined recently as the finance co-chair of the LEDS GB, and is of course our key advisor for all the work that we do in the Asia Pacific region on climate finance. And he's been an active member in ensuring that we work towards making transactions happen, as he mentions himself. He is currently the Southeast Asia Engagement Lead for Energy and Climate at the World Resource Institute. And he has over 20 years of experience in climate finance, ranging from financing clean energy, including leading business development of 22 megawatts of successfully commissioned renewable energy projects. And he's also been a pioneer in working as the managing director for Philippines of Allotrope Partners, a US-based clean energy investment and advisory services firm. He's also initiated the Green Bankings Initiative, an ASEAN-wide program aiming to mobilize private green finance. It is my pleasure to invite Mr. Marlon to this platform. Thank you so much. Over to you, Marlon.
Thank you, Pratibha, for the kind introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. And I hope everyone has been keeping safe, healthy, and well amid these challenging times. I'm joining you from Manila, Philippines, and welcome you all to this training today, brought by the Low Emissions Development Strategies Global Partnership, AsiaLeds, in coordination and with support from the GIZ and the German International Climate Initiative. My name is Marlon Apañada, and I am humbled to be invited to speak in today's event. We are here today, given the context that the new rules on Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, agreed at COP26 in Glasgow, offer an international governance framework for deploying environmentally effective and transparent carbon markets. Indeed, 6 years after signing off on the Paris Climate Agreement, rules for implementing Article 6 have been approved by negotiators, paving the way for more effective cross-border cooperation. These carbon markets could help enable companies and other private actors to achieve their net zero targets at possibly lower cost. Article 6 carbon market mechanisms can also generate additional revenues for emissions reduction projects, which might help enhance the commercial viability of those projects. I am truly confident that our resource person today, Mr. Jolt Lengyel, I hope I am pronouncing that correctly. Correct? Climate action and carbon market pioneer, economist, World Bank consultant, founding member of Europe's first EU emission trading system auditing cooperative called Verico SCE, and key expert for multiple EU-funded technical assistance interventions with and in a significant number of Asian countries, can help us learn, engage, and eventually proceed with transactions in the global carbon markets. Mr. Lengyel is truly a thought leader, and I'm happy to share that I keenly follow his posts on LinkedIn. They are timely and cutting edge, often thought-provoking and truly educational. Today's topic on carbon markets is an especially significant one for me because some years back, more than a decade ago, I was a practitioner in the Kyoto Protocol's Clean Development Mechanism, or CDM, helping to originate and develop emission reduction purchase agreements, or called ERPAs before, from Southeast Asia's greenhouse gas abatement projects. I am curious to see and learn how the conversations and mechanisms for carbon markets have evolved a decade hence. Learning from experience from the CDM, our collective work ahead will help to progressively increase the environmental and social integrity, liquidity, and value of international carbon markets. I am truly excited to learn more from this training. Next slide, please. But first, an introduction to the Finance Working Group, which is geared towards accelerating transformational change within the finance-related work of the Low Emissions Development Strategies Global Partnership, or LEDS GP. Next slide, please. So the Finance Working Group, as you can see in the screen, plays a critical role in bridging economic and social recovery with climate ambition to ensure a green, resilient, and transformational recovery process. So our aims include stimulating private sector investment, highlighting innovative financing strategies, sharing lessons and approaches, and responding to members' needs and requests for knowledge and skills for which this platform is part of. Next slide, please. The Finance Working Group's pillars of work can be shown here and can be seen here, with 3 levels of impactful work being focused for this year. First one is an accelerating private sector investment in low emission development strategies and nationally determined contributions, or what we call LEDs and NDCs, via fostering public-private coalitions, amplifying best practices on policies and regulatory frameworks, as well as implementing pilot projects and pioneering actions. The second lever, or pillar of work, is on peer learning and knowledge sharing, including convening and fostering communities of practice on financing, compiling and disseminating best practices and resources, as well as providing no-cost advisory services to practitioners to scale up financing streams. The third one is on financing instruments and innovation, highlighting best practices, piloting financing mechanisms and approaches, and assessing options and providing matchmaking services. Next slide, please. The Finance Working Group for points of contact. I am joined by my global co-chair for this Finance Working Group, Ms. Joanne Manda of UNDP's Africa Finance Sector Hub. Joanne is such a fantastic and proactive co-chair for this Finance Working Group. And for the LEDS GP Global Secretariat at GIZ, you can contact Mr. Felipe Gomez Villota, who's a technical coordinator at GIZ. Next slide, please. Now, for the AsiaLeds Partnership, this was launched in 2012 as a voluntary regional network that promotes and enables low emission, climate resilient development, supporting NDCs and long-term low emission development strategies. And it is now operating through 3 regional platforms. And now it has it counts more than 400 organizations, 65 government agencies from 14 Asian countries, and more than 800 individual members. And we are enjoined to be part, to be active, and contribute to the AsiaLeds Partnership. Next slide, please. So part of the communities of practice in the AsiaLeds Partnership is the NDC Finance Communities of Practice. So we have more than 50 members from 9 countries. We have seen the knowledge products it has produced on green bonds in India, Beijing's experience on emission trading scheme, as well as a deep dive training on green bonds. So you can join this community of practice focusing on NDC finance under the AsiaLeds Partnership. Next slide, please. So as part of the NDC Finance Community of Practice, are these focal areas that are truly important and at the cutting edge of everyone's conversations as we talk about climate finance: blended finance, green bonds, and carbon markets. So today we are focused on carbon markets, and we are hoping that this learning event will jumpstart your conversations and set ambitions, curate a program of actions that will lead to transactions amongst your respective organizations. So the NDC Finance Community of Practice supports countries in the Asia-Pacific region, and we provide a platform for peer learning, technical assistance, and enhancing access to good practices, tools and methodologies, success stories, as well as online sessions and in-person workshops such as this. You are invited as well to join its upcoming activities on peer learning on green bonds for Asia and Africa in March this month, as well as the development of project notes for high-impact e-mobility projects in the Philippines and Bhutan. Next slide, please. So with this, I end my introduction, and I welcome you all to this really exciting and hopefully insightful and interactive training on carbon markets. You are invited as well to join the NDC Finance Community of Practice as we engage, elevate, and amplify the needs for collective and coordinated action towards our shared climate ambitions. Thank you very much. Pratibha?
Thanks, Marlon, so much. It's been a pleasure to work with you, and we hope that the participants too have sought inspiration and will come back to us for any kind of technical assistance or any kind of support that they need from the NDC Community of Practice. Thank you so much. So now moving on to the session in particular. As you know, Marlon has already very eloquently introduced our lead trainer for today, Zolt Yengyal. So I would now like to hand it over to him as he takes the session forward and guides us through the interactive session. Thanks. Over to you, Zolt. Yeah, Zolt, you're on mute.
Yes. Sorry for this technical trouble. I lost control of my screen and I was not able to speak whilst I was trying to share my screen. So first of all, thank you very much, Pratibha and Marlon, for the very, very kind words of introductions, in which I think let me just reflect on one aspect, which would hopefully be very, very useful in the coming 3 days, that I see myself as a practitioner in these carbon markets and with these instruments, and not as someone who is approaching this from an academic or from a consultancy angle. And I think this will always be very, very important, because I think we would see the details where the devil is all the time when it comes to these markets. And I think that would also be the most helpful from your perspective of actually seeing the whole picture from the conceptual underpinnings of the carbon markets and economic instruments to the very nitty-gritty of how they actually work, how they should work, and how they haven't worked. And I think Marlon's introductions and reference back to the CDM times, good old days of the Kyoto mechanism is really, really telling, because sometimes I feel that we have forgotten those lessons and we are reinventing the wheels. So by means of introduction, I thought of bringing up something which just came out today, and I think which the audience doesn't really need any reminding, but when it comes to you going out and arguing why it is so important to deal with climate change mitigation and adaptation, then I think it is always helpful to recall what the latest IPCC report and what the scientists are telling us. And there is just no more unequivocal and clearer voice in this respect than today's report on impacts, adaptation and vulnerability, in which you will find a sentence which links adaptation and mitigation, basically stating the known, but facing the truth is something what I guess does never hurt, and I think we may need a lot of ammunition to do that. And that, just let me read out, and this is the concluding sentence of the policy summary section, in which the authors, again, in coordination with all those governments in the world who are part of the IPCC, declare that any further delay in concreted anticipatory global action on adaptation and mitigation implies that we will miss this brief and rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. It's stark. It really reflects on the procrastination of the last 3 decades, but it's never too late to act. And that's why I'm so glad that actually we have hundreds of participants in your region of the world joining this training for the coming days. And I'm just very hopeful that I would be able to share experiences of the past more than 2 decades working in this field and trying to advance climate action. Today, oops. Hold on, again, a tiny technical debate. I mean, today is also an extremely sad day, which we would all remember from the war in Ukraine. And this is a message on stopping the war from the basement of the pediatric hospital of Kiev, where those cancer patients' children are now surviving a very deadly attack. And then, just on the count of getting to know each other, we really would like to figure out why you are here, who you are, and therefore we would like to hear a little bit about you. And as Pratibha already mentioned, we are using the AsiaLeds platform. So I really would like to ask everyone to get on the computer or on the mobile phones this particular link to be clicked. And this is something which is coming up in the chat window. So you don't need to type if you want to copy paste the little red link at the bottom. Or you can copy paste it from the chat window, or alternatively, you can type in or use the QR code. So we are just trying to get to know each other with an audience of a few hundred people. I think it is really, really important. But in the same way as it would be important if we meet in person, which I think would still take some time in these pandemic times. So our first question is coming up on the screen on asking you which country or region do you represent, and I really would like to ask you to give an answer again on a country or a region what you are identified with, and then we will have your answers shown on the screen, so we will have a very good idea, and you will have a very good idea whom you are attending this event. And at this moment, my colleagues from the APL Secretariat will take over control and will show you the results as they are coming up on the screen. As you are typing in, let me tell you that I am Hungarian. That's why I have that unpronounceable name. And I live, yes, and here comes, and this is what we now see with the dynamics. Well, thank you very much. Not only sharing the information, but for the little hearts coming up on our screens, which is a great surprise to me of seeing our slides having these elements. And not surprisingly, what we see emerging is that, well, the LEDS countries, the APL Secretariat covered countries, are the ones represented most in the audience. Somehow also reflecting their size. Not surprisingly, India, with its obviously largest population, taking the lead, having Indonesians, Vietnamese, Philippines, I think somewhere I should see Chinese Taipei coming up on the screen. But yes, we go as far as Nigeria and the US and Germany. But obviously we have participants from Bangladesh and some other countries and now I see Laos turning up on the screen. What we know from the registrations that it's a really, really nice variety of participation covering the region, which really shows how this subject is really timely, how economic instruments should be used and could be used for advancing, scaling up and speeding up climate action. And I think with that, let's move to the next slide. So if I can ask our colleagues to move and to raise that question, which is just a bit on a reflection on gender, which appears to be on many occasions a somehow forgotten aspect of climate action, in which I think we really need to emphasize the known that when it comes to either to household decisions or to political decisions, women must have a far bigger role, whilst obviously in families you already have a big role. And I think we would just now be seeing the results on the gender split of the audience. And again, not surprisingly, after the two of us who have spoken are males, and only Pratibha representing, although at the ALPI Secretariat the balance is really there. But this is something which gives us some hope that, unlike at UNFCCC negotiations, unlike at the very top level discussions where certainly a male overrepresentation occurs and females, other disadvantaged groups or the youth are not represented, here we have the reality on, showing who is more interested in climate action. I'm hopeful that this competition would give us a balanced view. Again, from my own experience, recalling my exposure to work in Southeast Asia, in Malaysia, in Vietnam, and in India, I have met very inspiring civil servants, businesswomen, municipal leaders, and a lot of technical experts from both groups, and in this respect, I'm also very happy to see that today we would have perhaps a 50-50 split. We will see. So I guess what I can conclude by looking at these two issues, that we do have balance. I wish we would have that balance in the negotiations. We would have that balance in representing your countries in the international climate action field. And with that, let's move to the next slide. And that is really trying to figure out why you are here and what entity you are representing. And I should also tell you that we have well over 200 participants by now. And here comes a question which I think we have been looking at from the very beginning of the training, assuming that we would have a very healthy spread of participants who represent national governments, local, municipal, or sub-national governments. But obviously we also need to have those who are representing the private sector, a key climate action player. And then obviously we would have those NGOs, CSOs who are looking at climate action from their own perspective. And not surprisingly, we have representatives of international organizations who are working on climate action, who would be listening to this training, and who would hopefully be able to incorporate some of the lessons learned and the discussions. And again, this gives us an extremely nice balance, really highlighting the fact that climate action should occur at each and every level. And again, the roles could be very different from a national perspective, where you would have the joy of introducing climate economic measures and policies, and formulating their strategies, to the level of the regions and municipalities, where you would actually be focusing more on the physical implementation of preventive actions, of mitigation, and building resilience into your infrastructure. And then seeing companies, the corporate sector, being here is also extremely important, because they will be the ones who will be facing all these regulations, and they will be the ones who will be active in the climate action sector through these various instruments, project-based instruments we will be talking about in the coming days. Could we then move to the next slide, please? And that is really asking the question of, just a second, and you will see the next slide coming up. So this is a far more personal question, which would come up on your screen. And this is really asking the question, who is your personal climate hero? Who is the person who you follow? Who is the person whom you are looking up? And on that, again, reflecting the very fact that I come from Europe with a limited understanding of Asia, Southeast Asia in particular, I should really ask you rather than take my own assumptions on whom you follow. And on that, what we are trying to do is a quick session, brainstorming, in which you will be allowed to put up the actual names of these people, which then will be collated automatically. And those who are having the highest votes, again, fully depending on your own ideas. And obviously, I'm not referring to Greta Thunberg only, but to all those people whom you follow and whom you think are inspirational in climate action. That's why I call this session as your climate heroes will then be shown to you, and then you can actually vote on them, and then we will have a very precise and very personal view on how you look at and how who you follow and whom you consider a climate hero. This might be a big stretch in terms of the technology. So we are seeing your climate heroes on the screen, in which we would probably be able to move to the next session, which is the actual voting part. So if you have put up your suggestions, and obviously I see large number of suggestions coming up, then we should really move to the next stage by pressing, my colleagues pressing the voting button at the bottom, allowing you actually to vote on those people whom you have put up on the screen. And then if technology is with us, this will be an extremely democratic, extremely efficient voting on which nobody really knows what would come out. But with a bit of waiting, we will do that. And I'm really, really happy to see that you are listing local people even from your own communities, from your own countries. And obviously I see big names coming up, such as Bill McKibben on the screen as well. And yes, not surprisingly, Greta Thunberg sits in the front of my screen, but that doesn't mean that she should be the person you are voting for. And votes are coming in. So again, here, without knowing the end result, I think I can really, really state one of my expectations is that we are looking at a global challenge where obviously we all need to act. But when it comes to the most inspiring heroes, actually those who are making a change in your own country, in your own region, in your own city, would always be on top of this list. And I think that is very, very normal, because we shouldn't be waiting for others on other continents to get these changes, these transformational changes established. We really, really need all the people all around, on the ground to do this. And I think, I see votes coming in, and then in the interest of time, we should be showing some results. Apologies for cutting short the actual voting session. And yes, as expected, we would have locals winning, and that's to me the greatest sign on actually action taking place. Once more, apologies that we couldn't have the hundreds of you voting, but the bottom line here is that we really wanted to demonstrate that anyone who is serious in this field would have a local hero, and here we are. So I think the results will be shared, so you can look this up, and let's move to the next slide, please. And I think this is the simplest question. What are the things, what are the reasons which brought you here today? And after seeing that results, I will be diving into my presentation, my detailed presentations, with the hope that our expectations on the reasons, on the subjects, are fully in line with yours. And so this is the moment of truth that in our design of the training, in our way of preparing for these coming 3 days, we got it right with preparing for, again, a very balanced audience with various background and therefore with various interests. And again, without interfering with your answers, just let me share as the little hearts and the votes are flying in, that we expected and we designed the training with this very, very broad audience and broad target ideas or needs in mind, with the view that we really need to cater for those who are in charge of legislating, those who are in charge of coming up with the regulations with respect to economic instruments, carbon markets, whilst we would also be talking to those who will be regulated by these markets and who are just standing by to actually act on, for example, these mechanisms established at COP26 after this 6 years of gestation period for carbon markets. And therefore, again, what I see on the screen really supports this idea, our assumption for the training, that we do have representatives from all of these groups, obviously indicating that most of these people could have multiple interests. And that's why we have, again, an extremely balanced view of particular subjects, which we will all be covering in the coming days. And I think with that, we should really move to the training itself. But I think it was necessary to get a sort of reconfirmation and a full understanding of who you are, why you are here, and keeping that in my mind really helps running the show for the coming 3 days with the great help of APR colleagues on the ground. So let me just take back control for the slides and dive into the training session. So apologies for the technical troubles. Yes. So what? So our first, and we will have 3 sessions today. We really start with the very big picture, the fundamentals of how economics or carbon or climate economics work, or how it doesn't work.
Can you make it in full screen? We can't see the slides, just see it as the first slide.
Hold on, I thought I am on full screen, but you don't see my full slide?
No, we see it in the PPT format.
Hold on, then let me stop and then restart. Just 1 second, and again, apologies from all of you. So I start screen and then I go to the first and then I share and I start the presentation.
You can show it in slide share slideshow mode.
Yes, and this is what I have pressed. Is it?
Yes,
Yeah.
now we can see.
Again, I think not by the end of the 3 days, but well before, we will be seamless on this. So today is really about the rationale, providing the sort of economics, the bigger picture of the good and the bad economics on carbon pricing. So we have set a handful of learning objectives for today, with the view that it will help you to understand why carbon pricing is an effective and cost-efficient instrument in our climate crisis. We will obviously look at the key principles on carbon pricing and the trade-offs, the benefits, and the drawbacks. And we will be also looking at how, in different ways, carbon can be priced. And obviously, we will look at how carbon pricing have evolved in the world over time. So obviously, the first question really, why we need to have carbon pricing, why it came alive, why it has become a flagship or at least an important climate change mitigation instrument. What are the detailed options and how we are going to what we have learned, what we have done, and how we can deal with this. So when we look at the climate challenge, I guess it doesn't need to be explained what we are looking at, how it exacerbates all sorts of extreme weather events, and how in the last 20 years we really have faced a climate, and how even we are losing our proverbs related to climate because they are no longer hold value. So when it comes to looking at this problem from a perspective which is easy to understand, I think the best way of doing this is bringing up the whole concept of the carbon budget. And this is something which, I guess, relatively easily and comprehensively links the volume of carbon CO2 or CO2 equivalents of greenhouse gases being emitted, and the amount what could be emitted until we hit those very, very dangerous thresholds, what the IPCC is so unequivocal about it. So if we are looking at, and again, looking back 6 years and turn back our understanding to that time when obviously we already knew a lot about climate change, and we knew that this is a big issue. The idea really came up, and it's very, very simple, that let's figure out goals and let's agree globally on how we reduce emissions in order to reach those targets. Obviously, politicians are not always eager to talk about the nitty-gritty. They are very happy to set goals, but if you ask the scientists, then they can translate the Paris Agreement into these figures. So when it comes to the Paris Agreement's goal of keeping temperature rise below 2 degrees, or its aspirational goal, keeping it under 1.5, recalling that in the meantime, since Paris, we really established that 1.5 must be our goal. 2 degrees is just too far. It implies passing thresholds which we should not be risking. So if you look at the top left part of the screen, and you see how and what has been emitted and what is left in order to reach that particular concentration in the atmosphere, which would keep us within that 1.5 degree, you see a shockingly small number. The 420 gigatons equals to, less than 10 years of emissions at present rate. You may recall those headers that we have 10 years to avert a climate catastrophe. And if you look at these figures, that is very, very clear. The message is in this respect very, very simple. We have very little left in order to stay within those borders or within those thresholds. So if we are moving down on the chart, and if you look at on the left-hand side of how we have performed since 1991, the UNFCCC Rio conference, when mankind recognized the importance of climate change, of greenhouse gases, and said that it really, something needs to be about it, at least they need to be stabilized and definitely decreased, we could really recognize that our global efforts has not led to any significant decreases. The trend was a steady increase, and the only dents what you see is the economic crisis or the political crisis, which then resulted, in case of the collapse of the Soviet Union, of closing down very old, very polluting industries, or looking at the 2009 financial crisis, really bringing the local economy to a halt. And then, in this respect, it's really important to mention that we have COVID. And again, the really shocking thing, what you actually see by comparing the left-hand side chart showing the COVID drop and the right-hand side chart really showing how we can deal with the remaining carbon budget. And the really painful discovery is what COVID achieved in terms of a multiple percentage decrease, completely unparalleled, is something what we need, but not in a year of COVID, but year on year until 2030 and then until 2050 in order to reduce emissions. This is obviously an extremely painful message, because had we acted earlier, the decreasing path of what we face in order to reduce to net zero would be far less steep. Again, the right-hand side shows that there are still various scenarios and various pathways we can follow. But one thing is very clear: the further we procrastinate, the further we wait, the steeper the reduction must be. And again, recalling how painful pandemic closures and economies coming to a halt actually resulted in the similar level of emission reductions in a single year, you can imagine how difficult and how challenging this task is. So by moving to the next angle, we have another question. Again, we assume that you are in climate action. That is the reason why you are here. And I'm asking my colleagues to bring up the next slide. How would you regulate? Knowing that this is something which is very urgent, this is very severe, what would you do? Use price-based instruments, addressing the economics of climate change, what we are talking in these coming days. Would you use regulation, what we are all used to when you are told what not to do? For example, you would use technology support policies, which would spur innovation, which would bring us all those technical solutions, hopefully fast and quick, what we need to solve this issue. Or we would just share all the knowledge what we have and move forward with the view that people would follow best advice and they would be not acting against their own interest. So could we just bring up that slide and see what, yeah, sorry, I guess, yes, we made a mistake. Could we just move to the next slide? This is really important because obviously this captures, and then just one more, please. Yeah, could we just move to the next? Sorry, my screen is delayed. Yes, sorry, thank you. This is the one what we are now looking at. And again, what we wanted to capture here is really important. When you have such a huge crisis with the scale and speed required, then we really need the entire machinery. And I think what you will understand by the end of this training, that carbon pricing, economic instruments are absolutely essential, but they are not sufficient to solve this crisis. So our training is obviously focusing on this angle, but we really need to acknowledge that we must use the entire machinery, actually all those instruments what you are now voting for in our fight for climate change. And this needs to be kept in mind because in the Paris setup, instruments, Article 6 instruments, play a role, but obviously they are playing a supportive role of the overall concept of really acting in each and every country, depending in its own capacities to reduce emissions. Otherwise, if we are not using the heavy machinery, the heavy regulatory tools which we have in our hands, we are not going to achieve those very steep reductions what we need. So by seeing the results, I again see that you would have a preference which is balanced, whereby the least preferred option is really information and voluntary action, which is all the time the weakest. And I think that has been also a lesson from the last 20 years that, you know, we should use these, but that would not make a big difference in terms of emissions. We really need the technologies being supported which would deliver this change. We need command and control regulation because this really requires angles and elements what cannot be addressed with pricing instruments. So we need all of these. And with that, let's move back to the presentation. So I just take back control. So when it comes to the instruments, what we are looking at and what we will be covering in today's presentation will be a subset of those available to us, those you have just voted for. So we will be looking at all those instruments which are helping to stabilize and obviously then reduce drastically emissions. And at the same time, we are not losing sight of how all these investments should also be resilient and already preparing for the climate change which is baked into our systems. So it also emphasizes what I think the IPCC report brought up very clearly, and which was my opening slide, how mitigation and adaptation are completely interconnected and how all the things what we are doing should be resilient for the climate change what we face. So with the price-based instruments, we are looking at taxes and charges. You know, we are all paying taxes. We know how taxes can be actually set on anything, and then how we pay them. Then carbon pricing of cap and trade, so emission trading schemes, and baseline and credit schemes, where project-based mechanisms. And we would also be looking at a little bit to tradable permits, which are related to the physical features of particular products, such as electricity. So this will be our cover. And then I guess I sounded probably very optimistic and very positive about this, but John Olivier had a slightly different view.
Complicated. So to break down the logic behind it, I've enlisted the help of a guy who's made a career out of explaining complex ideas with fun visual stunts.
Hi, John. Bill Nye, the science guy here. I'm going to explain the complicated logic behind carbon pricing. But first, safety glasses on. When something costs more, people buy less of it. Safety glasses off. That's it.
And obviously with that, we could even stop our training, but we don't, because we move forward and we dive into those details on how and why prices could really be used as a very effective and very important tool in actually changing behavior, changing entire industries, and changing how we operate and therefore what we emit. So the way how economists are framing climate change is something which is called the market failure. And I guess this is really the core conceptually of really recognizing the fact that climate change is really a result of this feature of which we call a market failure, because we really see the evidence on how we act and how those who are damaging others by emitting greenhouse gases do not pay, or they are actually not influenced by their own actions, or their actions influences everyone, not only themselves. And obviously this is something which creates damages on a far larger scale than we have seen in the two world wars. This is something which is extremely serious on its own scale, and then because of its nature as the way how the climate cost of our actions is not included in the economic activities, is something what we need to look at. And obviously that's where economists like myself say, oh, this is easy. If something is not included in the bill, then the only thing what we need to do is include that so-called externality and make the polluter pay. And if the polluters are paying, then surprise, surprise, this market failure may evaporate. And this is something whereby you simply apply a very simple principle that the entity who are responsible for this particular damage is not the entity who suffer its consequences. And if we make those people who are emitting suffer the consequences, at least the economic consequences of their emissions, then they will change their behavior. Then there will be solutions which would come forward through markets and which would finally solve this issue. You may ask that how comes that markets, which apparently caused the problem in the first place because they had a failure, would then be solved to actually eliminate that problem. And that's also the economist argument, whereby if you change the rules of the market, then it could actually address those issues. And this is why framing climate change as a market failure really helps us to find the solutions, again, the market solutions, which would help dealing with this. I think if you have learned economics or if you just looked at climate change, you have also came across with comparisons with the tragedy of commons, in which public goods are used without any restrictions and they are then destroyed. You may recall the story of the Easter Islanders who occupied an island and then they cut all the trees. So they completely undermined their own living conditions, and obviously then they left the islands, and that's why we have the tortoises and obviously those wonderful structures on Easter Island. The big difference between us and the Iceland Islanders is that we know what the problem is. We know what the market failure is, which then can be addressed. And that's really the core, the fundamental issue with using economic instruments to address climate change. If we change the rules which created the problem at the first place, then we should be able to address this challenge. And that's something which has been known for a long time. I think probably all know Nicholas Stern's review from 2008 on the economics of climate change, on which we base our arguments since then. But even then, his arguments were not new. Looking back to the 20s, Pigou has already advocated for solutions which address externalities and market failures. So we do have an understanding what to do. And this is the point where carbon pricing comes into the picture, with the view that by putting a price on every ton of CO2 which is emitted, the polluter principle can be actually introduced. And then as soon as the polluter pays, its behavior could change. Obviously, this then incentivizes all those operators, all those emitters, and we know who is emitting and who is emitting what, investing in and switching to low carbon technologies. So the arguments, the reasoning on the top level, I think is relatively straightforward and it's easy to understand. Obviously, how to implement it, this is now the big question. And that's also the issue where you look at the different aspects of the economy, and you really need to establish that that signal on the pricing carbon really reaches everyone. And then we will ask how it reaches everyone and what would be the impacts. You do have production where obviously the producers will have a very clear incentive to use less carbon intensive materials, because the more carbon intensive materials and processes they use, the more they pay. Obviously, this has an impact on consumers who would end up using less carbon intensive goods and services because they tend to be cost more, and they will be sort of channeled, consumption will be channeled to alternatives. Obviously, we will come back to this later. This really brings up the question how carbon pricing actually creates the alternatives, because we not only need to be told through prices that something is bad and therefore it's more expensive, but we also need to have a valuable and a valid, plausible choice. It obviously gives a very clear signal to investors, because obviously if it comes to have a penalty for carbon intensive assets, perhaps them becoming stranded assets which no one wants or no one is able to utilize because of the cost associated with them, investors would be turning towards less carbon intensive activities and technologies. And that also leads to innovation, which would create financial incentive to develop those low carbon products, processes, and technologies. So again, there is a very consistent signal and a very consistent picture that in an economy which is fueled or oiled by money, if you put a price on carbon, that by definition reaches each and every segment, and then they will align with that carbon price, and then we all move towards a less carbon intensive economy. So obviously then, taking a quick step back, we really need to ask the question, how this then relates to all other societal goals. And on this, it's really a coincidence that the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals have been created in a rather coincidental manner. And then by looking at those issues where we do have an impact by climate action or by carbon pricing, we would realize that this is actually almost all of them. And that's really the point where we need to realize the trade-offs in between these elements. And that's, I'm just bringing up with a handful of cycles, but then I'm just bringing up a few examples. And again, this is where it gets very tricky, because with the introduction, you would argue that, well, let's get those carbon prices introduced, and all of a sudden, we will be moving in the right direction. That's true. But obviously, again, we have a question on the speed, how far we move in that direction, but we also have the trade-off. What happens if you have carbon prices and prices increasing for disadvantaged low-income communities, vulnerable people, when they are receiving the message that what they are heating with or cooking with isn't really good for the climate? This is obviously a point where you can turn around and say that whatever is generated as a revenue from pricing carbon could really be channeled back to those communities who are affected. There are examples, not hypothetical, but real examples, how for poverty alleviation, how for those people who suffer most actually from the impacts of climate change in general, but also from local air pollution and air quality, these revenues could be channeled back, and they could actually improve their standing and improve their life vis-a-vis their poverty level. Obviously, the public health aspect, which I mentioned, the good news in this respect is that if you stop burning highly carbon intensive coal, you all of a sudden improve air quality. I think Beijing, China, and Chinese cities are really great examples where these benefits came hand in hand, where actually climate action was not even driven by the climate considerations, but they were driven by public health considerations and air quality considerations. Being in Katowice for the COP, I had the memory of really choking by getting air in, which was so full of smoke because of the coal mining era using coal for cooking coal for heating, and therefore having major air quality issues. And then obviously when it comes to other goals which are more related, such as universal, affordable and clean energy access, climate change goes really hand in hand with that particular action and activity. When it comes to two issues which I think important to highlight again, of really showing a bit of the complexities and the underlying challenges with their thinking, we do have decent work and economic growth, which is now increasingly described as green economic growth, increasing employment. And certainly, whilst we need a just transition, and we really need to keep in mind that particular people would be losing their jobs because particular industries need to transition themselves, or some of them would come to an end. Think of coal mining and coal-based power. The jobs which are created by, for example, the renewable energy, which is more labor-intensive than the actual power generation based on traditional fossil fuel mining, really help those technologies, which not only brings the climate benefits, but which also brings the jobs and that green economic growth. So in this respect, there is a complex relationship. There are definitely losers, but if this is planned, if transition is planned, including its finance aspects, then we would be able to move ahead by actually improving economic conditions, improving employment, and so on. And then we look at number 13, which is, I guess, most of our favorite subject among the SDGs, where certainly carbon pricing is not a controversial subject. It comes very easily, and obviously it also comes with this sort of mentioning of fossil fuel subsidies, whereby we look at another externality when someone is unjustifiable supports polluting things, whilst instead of actually putting a price, we have been putting actually added public finances to subsidies on fossil fuels. We will come back to that later. So what are the options? And this is now a question again on our slides. What would you think of by just listening to me until this point, and obviously having your general interest in climate action? So my colleagues are just bringing up the next question on the slides. Thank you. And again, I was hoping that all those elements are coming up, what we are looking at in the coming days. And it's really amazing to see the dynamics of this word tile. Carbon tax fixated in the center, keep growing, and ETS, emission trading systems, having a bit of a dance around it. And then we have the really important angles, such as green bonds, really looking at how to finance and how to look at these issues from the finance perspective. We do have taxes on their own, and we have particular instruments, voluntary carbon market instruments. I even see CDM coming up, and then we see a handful of similarly worded things, like the ETS and the emission trading system coming up as two words, whilst obviously they cover the same issues. what I am really trying to find as we are coming to the close of the solution tile, that is there anything which I have not heard about? And the beauty is that I should tell you that at least I don't see anything which is unknown to me. So we have, I wouldn't say that this is the solution, but we really have carbon tax, cap and trade, emission trading, really coming up also with voluntary markets and its elements. So again, glad to see that we are on the same page, and then let's move back to the presentation. Hold on, it takes some time to get control back. And here we are. So the things what you have put up on your screen are somehow similar to what I'm presenting here. And what I have added to the elements what you have listed is a bit of a differentiation on really looking at how and whether they are used on the national or on the international scale, and whether they are more looking at setting targets on quantities, or whether they are looking at setting targets on the particular prices associated with emissions. Again, internalizing the externality, which are the emissions, happens through various instruments, and the focus, the way how these instruments are structured, could be different from these particular angles of being focusing on the pricing or focusing on the particular quantity to be allowed to be emitted, and whether we are looking at international or national mechanisms. So moving quicker to these differentiations, we do have the two different approaches for actually achieving the same goals. And this is where we look at, on the left-hand side, emission trading systems, which sets the quantities to be allowed to be emitted. Again, remember our carbon budget. And then on the right-hand side, we are looking at setting a price, just making sure that this externality is priced. In the middle, you would really see a small analytical piece and reference on how the various price ranges, which could be set for the US, would then lead to particular dates in reaching the net zero target. Not surprisingly, if you look at the different colors corresponding to each other, the higher the price, the deeper the dive. The higher the price, the quicker you achieve those goals. Obviously, looking at it from an emission trading perspective, when you are really telling the actual amount which could be allowed, again, which could be seen as the red, blue, and green lines in terms of decreasing emissions, you would get the same result. So you are really looking at the same features of emission reductions driven by quantitative target setting or driven by a price setting. The price setting in this respect is an indirect way to influence the actual quantity being emitted. And then just moving at the details. So let's explore a little bit emission trading, in which we do have a limit, set a very strong and a very strict limit on the total emissions, which obviously decreases over time in order to reach a particular target, in which all those generally large emitters are getting permits, which are tradable permits. So if someone is able to emit less than the amount of permits they hold, then they can obviously sell those permits. And if someone is emitting more, then they buy. And this obviously leads for into a situation in which the cheapest emission reductions are realized all the time. And that's why, from an economic perspective, emission trading finds the cheapest way to actually achieve a particular level of emissions. And obviously that means that we have certainty on the outcome, because we have that ceiling. We have that amount which could be emitted. And that's, again, changes over time and goes towards a particular goal, be it net zero, for example. And then we have the corresponding choices by the players in the market to decide how this be done. And this would automatically lead to different prices. And as you see from the example of the EU emission trading system, the world's largest and longest standing emission trading scheme, to a huge volatility of prices. Again, we are looking at a time frame of the last 20 years in which the particular emission reductions between 1.3, 1.7, 2.4% per year has been set. And this was realized with this volatility of the prices. So let me just ask this question. What do you think happened at the moment when the EU was a couple of years into its emission trading scheme, setting targets very transparently on where those 12,000 large installations should go, and all of a sudden prices hit zero? What do you think the reasons were? Could we just bring up the next AHA slide, offering some answers? And again, talking about the EU ETS is really a great example. When you are the first in the world, you definitely make mistakes. But then if you are not the first in the world, you learn from those who have done this. So anybody thinking about the emission trading as a tool on a national level, capping large emitters and ensuring, which are normally, and this is the case of the EU, covers more than half of the Union by really looking at only 12,000 installations, you do need to learn from the ETS. That's a very simple message. You don't want to make the same mistakes. You want to be learning from other people's mistake. And that's why I'm really happy to see the answers coming in, showing what really happened. I mean, I guess I shouldn't be saying this because I'm influencing the answers, but the key message here, it was really important to see how initial design, which actually allowed member states to act on behalf of their own emitters, somehow persuading Brussels and all the other countries why they are going to emit so much, was introducing a major flow into the system. The regulators had no idea what these entities were emitting at the first place. Therefore, they had to be believing EU member states in their assessments. And obviously, those assessments were heavily influenced by industrial lobbies who were signaling particular figures, ensuring that the actual over-allocation occurred. So this is really the point where more allowances were issued than required. And obviously, this is a regulatory trap. You can design a system which has all the machinery, which actually works, but if you got your targets wrong, then certainly you are not going to reduce emissions, because obviously you wouldn't expect pricing carbon at near zero making any impact. And this is what happened in 2008, in late 2007 and 2008, which obviously then also coincided with the hitting of the economic crisis, which then had impacts on emission trading prices. And obviously, if you look at the right-hand side, and then can I just go back and receive back my presenting rights? So we are looking at the angle on how prices are at this moment really high rocketing, implying, and again, you will see that, bear with me a second. So if you look at the right-hand side, and this is still increasing, by now the EU regulatory machinery ended up solving the things finally and really putting an effective limit on the emissions, which is now pushing up the price. I understand that according to the schedule, we do have a break soon, but let me talk about the other side of the coin, the taxation, and then we will come back after a 10 minutes break, and I will quickly wrap up this session and dive into the next. So when it comes to setting a carbon tax on particular sectors, and again, we might be talking at obviously far large number of emitters, or we can look at particular fuels, and it's really up to your government to make the sectoral selection on setting a price on carbon. Then we do have certainty on the price, because obviously a tax always needs to be told it's how much per ton, and then that price is imposed, and then there will be a corresponding reduction in emissions. So in comparison to emission trading, when you do have clarity on the volume that will be emitted, and that would create a particular carbon price, it is the opposite. You set the price, which would then reduce emissions. You can be certain that 137 US dollars equivalent carbon price in Sweden would bring a bigger reduction than in the United Kingdom, the 25. Sweden, which put actually 29 US dollars back in 1990, so 30 years ago, has increased this carbon tax over time to this unprecedentedly high level, and obviously that helped Swedish economy to decarbonize in a very big way. So the third angle, and this is where we are really looking at the negative price, actually adding money to those who are using or producing fossil fuels, is really the most painful element of, I think, of the presentation today. If you recall the 2009 Pittsburgh G20 meeting, again, referring back to this old knowledge of how fossil fuel subsidies are distorting the markets and are bad for the climate, commitments were made. But then, as you see on the right-hand side, that negative price on carbon, that tens of billions, totaling to 460 only in the G20 countries, is still there. And that's an amount which is far more than we spend on actually promoting renewables. So it's a really shocking angle that we do have economic instruments and we do use carbon pricing since the 1970s, since the oil crisis, or even earlier, driven by other reasons, by energy security, also some very good reasons, such as affordable access to energy. But it's really shocking that when it comes to using an instrument, carbon taxation or carbon pricing, being introduced as new and novel and unknown, when we look at fossil fuel subsidies, we need to realize that this is something that we have been using, but we have been using a negative price on carbon. We are actually adding to those who are emitting instead of taking away from them. And that's something that really needs to be addressed very quickly. And that's where I think there is a lot of ongoing work to finally live up to the commitment of 2009 Pittsburgh on drastically reducing fossil fuel subsidies. And you may recall from COP26 that there has been an element on this. So, and then obviously this leads to the other aspect, which I was highlighting on international versus national markets. But what I suggest, sticking to the schedule of having a 9 minutes break, so cutting the break slightly shorter than planned, and come back in 10 minutes time, and then we continue. So you can grab a cup of coffee, a bite, or do whatever you need to do. But then let's meet in 9 minutes at 3:05 Indian times, and then we continue with this particular slide. Thank you.
Thanks, Zot. We'll meet in 10 minutes. Thank you.
So welcome back. Pravita, can you hear me? Welcome back.
Yes, we can hear you clearly.
Okay, so then I continue, and I think we are okay with time. So there is this flexibility on my side, but these are the elements what really need to be explored. So what we finish with is that there was this huge and distinct comparison between setting prices when it comes to taxation or setting quantitative targets resulting in various prices. And then the other angle, what we wanted to explore, whether this is international or whether this is national. And obviously, that's really the angle which brings in the carbon credits, the offsets, and the project-based instruments, in which you can actually connect the offsetting schemes and market mechanism, even taxation. So emission trading schemes, project-based schemes, and taxation schemes can really be connected with each other. And the idea is very simple. When you have particular activities, and this is in the top left corner of the ETS and tax-covered sectors in any nation, you may decide as a regulator that you would allow those entities to meet their obligations using not only the taxation or using the allowances, the permits, what they achieve or receive or buy in those particular emission trading schemes, but equal to a permit within an emission trading scheme, an offset, again denominated in the 1 ton of carbon, the common denominator for an allowance system, can be used to meet obligations. And this is really the issue, how offset credits as tradable certificates issued for actual emission reductions used in particular emission trading systems and tax systems. It's basically a regulatory choice. And obviously, this is something which not only applies to international offsets, it could also be applied to the non-covered sectors within the very same market. You could design a system in which the large installations, again, to think of the emission trading scheme of Europe, could actually buy credits from energy efficiency investments or any agricultural activities within their own countries. Intriguingly, and that the Kyoto Protocol was a very interesting period from this perspective, the EU emission trading system allowed international offsets from CDM joint implementation projects all around the world to be used as for compliance purposes, whilst there was no machinery designed within the European Union to deal with those 48% emissions, total European emissions, which actually happened and could be reduced next door. Again, the logic was that all those other sectors were also covered by various measures, improving their emission features and lowering their emissions. But this is really the grand picture where you would simply be able to design national systems with a window open, allowing offsetting schemes to generate the common denominator, the 1 ton of emission or emission reductions to be used in your system. And there are also places which considered tax solutions in which you either pay the tax or you show that you have purchased a particular offset scheme credit, which shows that equivalent of a ton of emissions what your operations have actually emitted. So then we really have this sort of solution in which the interlinkages are established between these key economic instruments, again, based on the view that a ton of carbon is a ton of carbon everywhere, and its value to the global atmosphere or the actual damage, what it causes, it is irrespective where it is coming from. Whilst obviously, we all know from our own experiences that the cost of reducing a particular emission could be very, very different. Again, coming back to Sweden, which has been doing this for 30 years in a very, very big way, you would really be surprised to find anything which is cheaper than $130 as a potential emission reductions. Very simply because their schemes have already incentivized to make emission reductions within that price range. Whilst obviously, if you look at other countries, you may find some very, very low-hanging fruits, very easy and cheap emission reductions. You would even find, but that's also true for the developed world, negative costs. You would find energy efficiency investments which still could be made. And somehow, if someone is able to create such an instrument to link those energy efficiency potentials and convert project potential into an offset, then we would still have non-covered sectors producing emission reductions through energy efficiency, for example. But this is now the big picture on showing how all these issues are interconnected. But then let's just look at the nitty-gritty and go back to the preconditions and the benefits and all those challenges which I have alluded to when it comes to carbon pricing. So what are the angles? What are the issues what a regulator really need to look at in introducing carbon pricing? And again, the beauty is that the academic literature obviously is very broad and wide on this. But if you look at the entire well-documented history of the European emission trading system, you would really, really discover all these angles working out in practice, seeing and showing how and why some of those preconditions could be overlooked, and sometimes there are preconditions which could be gamed, manipulated, or misunderstood. So I guess as an economist, let me start with the usual assumption that we have economically rational actors. And this is something where we are not talking about most of the time about human individuals, ourselves, who are, I guess, are emotional and irrational most of the time, but economic actors, large entities, where obviously a profit motive is very, very important. Therefore, if they are facing a particular cost or a price, then they would act accordingly. If you are able to internalize this externality of the carbon cost, then you would expect that economic entities would act rationally and would include all these things in their calculations. Therefore, the decisions will be made accordingly. It's really simple. If you would not expect a power plant acting irrationally when it buys the fuel. Obviously, when it buys the fuel, there will be an additional price tag, knowing that if they fuel that particular power plant and they generate electricity with a large carbon content, that will have a particular price immediately. Again, as we discussed, if it's a tax, then that price is absolutely known upfront. If it's an emission trading system, that's pretty much a price range on which obviously rational actors will figure out what that price would be. They know far more about their own cost structures than the regulators. And that's also a very strong argument why an instrument which may look uncertain in terms of its price impact, but it looks completely perfect in terms of its quantitative impact, is the right choice. You would get the economic actors who are rationally acting, reducing the emissions to a level what you want. Again, remember, we have a global carbon budget. This is something which is a finite amount which we need to reach. Therefore, an emission trading system which sets an X% annual reduction rate would work, and economic actors rationally internalize the messages. Obviously, we really need to have functioning markets, and this is a big question mark, because obviously we find that energy markets are not fully perfectly functioning from an economic perspective because of various reasons. And that's really the issue which we need to ask, that what happens if you have a carbon price which is not really getting to those who are making the decisions? What happens if it disappears? What happens if you have a carbon price which is in a hidden way somehow counterbalanced by subsidies? What happens if you introduce a carbon price but you fix the price of electricity for the final consumer? And these are really, really issues where you really need to ask these questions up front, because if it turns out that you have other measures in place which would mute the carbon signal, then it may not work effectively. Very simply because those who would be changing their behavior would change their economic decisions if that signal, the price signal of carbon, is not reaching the final consumers, then they may not change their actions. Obviously, we really need to have some technical machinery, because unless we know who is emitting what very precisely and very transparently in a verifiable manner, and that's where my Verico hat comes in as the first cooperative in the EU dealing with EU ETS installations as auditors, we do have a problem. You really can't enforce a system where you don't know where these emissions are coming from and actually how much CO2 is coming through a chimney. And in the EU ETS, literally we are looking at 12,000 very large chimneys, although there are some process emissions from cement manufacturing, and there are installations, think of a fossil oil refinery, where you would have not a single, but dozens or hundreds of chimneys to measure. Thanks God, the technology, which is cheaper and cheaper, is available to make measurements. And if you look at proxies or other solutions which are not putting too much burden on a particular emitter, you can also start trusting satellites, which are looking at and bringing really precise data on large emitting sites, be it complex or be it just a single chimney. Satellite data comparison and reconciliation with EU ETS data measured at particular emitters and also checked against the fossil fuel consumption and the various conversion factors resulted in surprisingly precise data. Then obviously we need to look at transaction costs, which are an issue, because you can create an extremely perfect regulation, but if that regulation is extremely expensive to actually implement, then you really need to ask twice whether this would work, whether those who will be asked to follow these rules would block it, or would just simply say that we all agree, but this is not feasible. And this is where I guess transaction costs could also be seen through the lens of the monitoring, reporting, and verification systems, because these are the costs which are brought in alongside such a system. And then there is a fundamental question. You can introduce, no matter how high a carbon price, but what happens if there are no solutions, if there are no ways of reducing those emissions, unless you shut down your activity? You really need to have those alternatives. And we talked about innovation beforehand. And also we talked about not only economically rational actors, but economically well-informed actors who would then be able to make these choices. So you see that the fundamentals are not that difficult to overcome, but they are rather complex, and it's a long list of assumptions which all need to be ticked in order to achieve the particular target and the particular goals of such a system. So again, a quick question session on trying to figure out what could be the benefits of carbon pricing. And I came up with a slightly cheeky list of false and true statements. So if you can just drive into the slides once more with the help of our colleagues and do a careful reading of the sometimes cheeky wording, you could please answer these questions. And I think control is with.
Yeah, I'm just waiting for the results to come in. I'll just share it.
And again, I apologize in advance that, yeah, language-wise, this would be slightly complex, but I couldn't really come up with very simple statements without becoming completely evident whether they are wrong or right, whether they are really moving in what directions they are influencing the actual emission levels. And I think what I'm hopeful of, that we are talking about instruments or even a single instrument, and then it may have really multiple impacts. And again, that's the beauty with pricing. Prices do have that ability to impact everything everywhere, because they are the language of business. They are the language of economics, which really goes through entire systems, sometimes seamlessly, sometimes not. And obviously on some occasions, and I think my example for the carbon price signal is really important from this perspective, on some occasions, you would have countervailing instruments, counteracting instruments, which are stopping a particular instrument, price or volume instrument, making an impact. And then, yeah, could you just press the show correct answer button as well? And again, what I'm really happy to see that you are as much of an expert as I am in this particular field. But even those who clicked some wrong answers, don't feel bad. I mean, this is something what can be learned, and this is really complex. But the other message, which I think is really important, that whenever you introduce carbon pricing, you do have a layer, a multiple set of positive impacts. And this is really important to understand, that we have something which obviously doesn't solve everything. On its own, it's insufficient, but it does hit many buttons. And as you see from the bars, we will really have multiple positive impacts, from revenue generation, cost-effective abatement of emission reductions, innovation, finance, and so on. Can I just take back control of the slides? So based on actually your answers, there is this little summary on how multiple benefits can be reaped from carbon pricing. And obviously some of them are really evident, that if you price something and it generates a revenue stream for the government that could really be used in a useful manner, that's really positive. You have the incentivization, you have the additional co-benefits. And there is one angle which I think is really important from our perspective, especially from the national regulator perspective, that we really need to admit that we don't know everything and we don't need to know everything. The operators of a plant would always know their operations better than we do. And therefore, an instrument, and that is the main argument for emission trading systems, where you set a quantitative target, or also when you tax a particular negative feature, would result in a situation when people would make those choices and those changes, which we might be completely even unaware of as regulators or as governments. And this is a really important factor to keep in mind, that the flexibility what an emission trading system provides those who are regulated is an inherent benefit, and that would actually reduce the cost of reaching a particular target. In other words, you can be certain that a particular target is reached at the lowest possible cost, implying that you may actually go ahead and you further reduce that quantitative target, seeing and experiencing that reaching that target is actually not that expensive as you originally believed. And that's a big lesson from any emission trading scheme, going back to the US on sulfur dioxide, that the regulators always overestimated the cost of compliance, and the actual regulated entities found always cheaper solutions to actually reach that particular level. And I think this really needs to give us hope when governments are saying how costly this energy transition is and how costly it is to reduce emissions. The private sector, innovation, technological skill would always find cheaper solutions. It obviously doesn't mean that this let's reduce emissions by 8% per year is not heavily costly, but what it shows that we could get the best out of our economies by setting targets and allowing economic players to decide how to reach them. And then obviously, and again, that's very clear from these questions and from these discussions, that there are major challenges on carbon pricing. Just consider increasing energy prices, and the impact on vulnerable parts of the population and particular communities. Then obviously you can also consider that selling carbon pricing, and I'm really using an economic term, so it's not persuading people, but really selling the idea is something which may prove unpopular. Again, very simply, having those sentiments that why we are using the markets for a problem actually caused by the markets, on which please do recall that internalizing market failures and addressing them within the markets is a valid and credible option. And then there are some very painful angles. What happens if you are the only one, and in this respect, I'm representing a region of that nature, the European Union, who really creates these flagship instruments, who puts the price on carbon? What would be the influence on the competitiveness of your own industries? How European players would sell goods which are more expensive when it comes to other competitors who may have not yet introduced these elements. This is really an issue which needs to be looked at. And this is now something which is by the so-called carbon border adjustment mechanism is being addressed in the EU. But obviously there is another fundamental angle to that. What happens if you start becoming very stringent on your emitters and they start moving abroad? And then you really, instead of solving a problem, you actually relocate a problem. This is called carbon leakage, and this is really an issue which calls for global governance, because otherwise we would end up in situations where we are pushing emitters to places which are less stringent, and then we would actually not improve the emission levels on a global scale. And then there is the very typical challenge that the arguments and the public discussions, including fighting industrial lobbies, results in a situation in which the carbon pricing is introduced. Hooray! You as the regulator, you as the government, you as the concerned citizen is happy, but the level of ambition, the actual decreasing target or the carbon tax is too low. We have countries, I don't want to name them, which has been living with a carbon tax of $2 for a decade. Do you think that $2 would make any difference? Collecting it, the paper on which it's written, or the actual transfer of that amount of money to a bank account of the government cost more than the actual amount paid in. And obviously that is not influencing or making any change in anyone's behavior. But that's something what you need to be prepared for, because that's another big historic lesson. Carbon pricing comes to life with low prices, with low ambition, because that is what can be politically solved. And that is the reason why in the last 30 years, we ended up with increasing emissions. So dealing with the challenges is really something that we will be looking at the next session in terms of addressing these complexities. But then let me just recall the 4 key areas and then offer a few insights on how this could be addressed. Again, the key message is that we need to be aware of these complexities, these trade-offs. We cannot turn a blind eye. We cannot let them go and hoping no one notice, but we really, really need to look at it from the start. If you don't, then the price will be too high to pay later on. And there are elements which are always very difficult to change retroactively. You put a lot of energy of designing a system, and if that system is wrong or it's full of mistakes, then it's far more difficult to change it than actually design it from the start. And again, as a proud European Union citizen, I am here to offer you that tonnage of mistakes, what we have done and included in our last 25 years of designing the world's largest operational emission trading system. So on public acceptance, you really need to engage all. And it's not a discussion between the emitters and the government. And again, that's a key message from the EU. NGOs and CSOs rightly grow suspicious because a lot of discussions happen behind closed doors. That was also the way how member states were trying to support their own industries, rather confidentially and in a secretive manner, knowing that they were not really doing the right thing. Obviously, public acceptance is absolutely key. We can't really solve the climate crisis with instruments which the public does not believe. Then obviously they will through democratic processes would question the instruments themselves, and then it would be very hard to explain retrospectively why public and stakeholder engagement were not part of the design process. And again, you design upfront. You don't design 10 years later. Redesigning is always far more difficult than actually get it right in the first place. And again, you will have a lot of adjustments on the way. That's also the reason why we have those increasing EU ETS prices, because particular twists and changes in the system, including a so-called market stability reserve, were introduced, which makes the system prone to external economic shocks. COVID, you would argue, wow, what a drop in production. Would not that kill the EU emission trading price? No, because there is a mechanism to deal with economic contraction. Then obviously we have the mitigation effect, where we really need to see the long-term goal. We need instruments which could be tuned to the changes or to the increasing ambition over time. Again, if you have a carbon budget in your head, which you distribute to yourself one way or another, but you know that you need to reach zero, then drawing those lines is not that difficult. Again, the results are very painful, but it is very clear what mitigation effect you want to reach and how you link any effects or any purposes set for a particular system for a particular period, which might be medium to short term, 5-10 years for an emission trading system. And you need to check whether this is in line with the overall long-term goal of the Paris Agreement, on which again, mid-term century decarbonization, or in case of India, 2070, in case of China, 2060 applies. Then competitiveness and carbon leakage. I think this is really the most hard to crack angle, because unless we are all moving ahead with a similar speed or a comparable speed, which is transparently set, we do have these concerns. If we have huge differences in the obligated level, in the acceptable level, or in the cost level of emissions all around the world, then we would soon see industries moving around to those places which are less costly to produce a particular good, which might be still in huge demand. Again, electricity tends to be something which cannot be traded over huge distances, or the losses will be similar to the cost of carbon. But when it comes to goods, this is really a big issue. And on that, there are various approaches, including the carbon border adjustment, including carbon clubs of those getting together who are setting similar levels of stringency as potential solutions. And then we have the distributional impacts, and this really comes back to the point how all these decisions affect workers of particular sectors, how it affects particular consumers, especially poorer households, which always need to be upfront calculated. And again, this is not rocket science. Energy price impacts have been known for, well, since we use energy. And then, adding a particular cost factor to that is not that difficult to calculate, and the impacts is not that difficult to calculate. But if it is not done and the redistribution and rebates are not designed, then these issues could cause major problems. And the circle then becomes full because public acceptance could really be heavily undermined by anything which affects people in an unjust or an unfair manner. And then just a very quick update on where we stand. So not surprisingly, the world has fallen in love with carbon pricing. And the reasons are very simple. This is very effective. This is very business friendly, especially if that friendliness constitutes in that rather observable situation that we do have systems with relatively low, on some occasions, ineffective carbon prices. And this is now a snapshot of actually 2020, and in 2021 there are new additions to the map. So you see that happily this is a global issue, and large number of countries are picking this up. And on some occasions, the US is really intriguing, where the country itself was not keen on federal level carbon pricing, but you have a lot of actually competing conceptual carbon pricing on the state level. And looking at your region, I guess the picture isn't that bad. Whilst obviously India is also working hard on really looking at carbon pricing and its institutionalization. So some key figures, again, it just really shows that this is growing, but again, there is a lot of room for improvement. We could get a far larger coverage. Again, the EU is a good example where the large emitting sites, which are easy to be included in an emission trading scheme, are 55% of emissions. And then obviously with taxation, a larger part is even covered. So I think the road ahead is very clear. Everyone needs to embrace carbon pricing. So the key takeaways from this session is, I hope that you would able to agree with me and argue more convincingly in the future that for a market failure, which is very clear, we have an efficient and market-based solution, and that's carbon pricing. Putting a price on carbon would make markets operate differently, and therefore reducing those emissions which they created at the first place. So again, in the logical level and on the argumentation, it just follows this very simple principle, what we apply to our lives, what we apply to other polluters for a long time, that the polluter should pay. And if the polluter pays, that signal would go through the entire economic system. Obviously, due to the different regulatory options what we have in our hands in most of the cases, carbon pricing is of no exception. There are different ways, and they are fundamentally based on whether we focus on the quantity and we tell what should be that firm value, what should be that threshold, that ceiling, what should be reached. And obviously this is something which goes on the declining scale. Or we could look at predominantly setting a particular price, a penalty, or a polluter fee on the emitted carbon, which drives emissions down in the same way or in a similar way as quantity reductions. And then again, a quick reflection on how pricing carbon is embraced. If you look at the original NDCs or the updated NDCs submitted before COP26, a larger and larger number of countries are doing this. So I think overall, it's a happy story. I think the unhappiness really comes from the point that we are running late, so to say, implementing all these mechanisms. And with that, let me move to the next slide. Just 1 second. Apologies. apologies, I just pressed the wrong button. So by, hold on. By moving from the overall argumentations and rationale.
But we still see the key takeaway slide.
Do you see my next slide, or it's not coming up? The policy mix is on the screen.
It just says key takeaways, the last slide that you showed us.
Hold on, then I need to stop sharing and coming up with the policy mix slide once more. Just a second. Yeah, it seems that probably did not really allow me to move between slides. 1 second. And now you see policy mix carbon pricing 02.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. And again, apologies. That's very quickly. So yeah, we covered the very big picture, the why and how, what's the sort of economic thinking behind. And then obviously we concluded that this is really complex. And then obviously we have competing policy objectives because yes, climate change is the biggest problem that mankind is facing, but it's not the only one. So we have competing policy objectives, and then we have a sort of policy toolbox for climate, which is becoming fuller and fuller because we know all these mechanisms, but obviously we have also talked about standards, technology measures, informational tools, and so on. So this is what we are now looking at in more detail. We will also look at how the climate policy instruments interact with each other and with carbon pricing. We will explore what are these different policy interactions. Are they supportive? Are they synergistic? Are they killing each other? And so on. Then we look at the solution of having this complexity, which is the policy alignment angle. And then we will really dive and take a few examples on how this instrument mix actually could work and what we have learned in particular jurisdictions about that. So the learning objectives are in this respect very clear. It's really looking at the interactions, really looking at the complexity of those complex roles what carbon pricing could actually play, and then get a little bit of a better understanding how all these issues are influencing each other and what are their interrelations. So a quick question. What other policy areas may impact the success and the design options for climate and carbon pricing policy? And that's a question in which we really would like to get a word cloud from you, and my colleagues should be opening this up. So when you think of this question on how to design the system, what are the other policy areas, from energy to poverty, social policy, what is connected to climate. You have a mind set on what links to climate. What are the other issues which you need to consider in order to actually be successful in climate or in carbon pricing? So just think of those which are influencing this policy field, what we are now focusing on. And I just would like to see your 1 or 2 words answer coming up on the word cloud, hopefully capturing how interconnected climate and carbon policy with the rest of the regulatory environment or the rest of our life. And I think probably we would have some results coming up on the screen. Yeah. And I am, again, I shouldn't be influencing your answer, so I will be very careful what I say. So then I think I take care of my voice and drinking a little bit as you are typing in your observations. Wow. I mean, poverty was in the center, very big for a long time, but obviously now we have, I think, the full complexity really mapped on how complex and how interconnected is carbon pricing or climate policies all the time. It really shows that this is not an isolated, it's not a silo, it is connected with all of our things in our lives. And let me just recall the SDGs. And I think one can argue that at the bottom of the SDG pyramid, so to say, if you are familiar with Johan Rockström's donut or wedding cake reshaping of the SDGs, are all those natural factors which allows us to live on the planet. And then we have social issues, and then we have economic issues where carbon prices comes in, and then we have the entirety of these things. And to me, this this map of factors really clearly shows that carbon pricing is not working in isolation, and there are another large number of issues which we must keep in mind when we design them. And this is what we will be talking about. So I just take back control if I can. And hopefully this will now, we would jump to the right place. Yes. So thank you for sharing your concerns, so to say, and your wise observations on how and what we need to consider when we look at this policy setup. And I think, again, a similarly complex capture and a conceptualization of how climate could really be seen as part of sustainable development, as a core interconnected factor, in which obviously we put the overall core mitigation goal. And we would talk about we talk about resilience and adaptation as an underlying and always applied subject. So when we reduce emissions, we always think of it as do it in a resilient manner as the core, in which we use climate policies and measures, including carbon pricing as a solution. But that is really surrounded by other policy areas, being general economic policies, social policies, the energy policy, whilst obviously being core in driving emissions, and environmental policies. And then this all sits in that broader context of energy security. Don't forget the trade-offs. Don't forget that if you sit on the largest coal reserves on Earth and you are the largest coal exporter, then you may consider particular things not as bad as they are. Or if you need to import particular fossil fuels and you don't have it, then you may have an even stronger argument from an energy security perspective to speed up a transformation away from the use of imported fossil fuels. Obviously, affordability and energy access are also very key considerations. Poverty reduction, or not to make poor people poorer by unwise policy choices. Industrial development, again, how you envisage your country in the future, and then all those elements on macroeconomic and fiscal objectives, defining your room of maneuvering, the amount of money what you can invest, the amount what you can actually devote to these issues. And then the underlying message, what we need to emphasize, that when we look at the climate policy instruments, and again the entirety of them, the four, including the price-based instruments, what we are talking about in these 3 days, we must accept that none of them is sufficient on its own. This is a big jigsaw puzzle, what requires all these elements, and we need to be carefully looking at all these issues. That's one of the biggest lessons from the European Green Deal, on how pricing on its own would not solve issues. We need the other tools because there are other market failures. There are other elements which cannot really be solved through pricing. And then, yeah, on the climate policy instruments, let me just give you a bit of a summary. And again, you can return to these things as we will be distributing the slides after the training. So when it comes to our round field, we have talked about the emission trading systems. We will be talking about the baseline and credit-based project mechanisms, project-based instruments, and we have carbon taxes. So in this respect, one can argue that the price-based instruments are a relatively not so complex part of this field with a number of instruments only. When it comes to technology support policies, the list is endless, and I have only set a few. But it really clearly shows that from public procurement changes to financial market interventions to R&D funding, there are a large number of tested and tried methods to deal with technology support policies, which would result in us having all those solutions, the technical solutions, what we need to solve the climate crisis. We have, and we should not really underestimate the impact of how consumers, us or obviously customers, being industrial or business players, would make their choices. If they are not informed well enough, they will make the wrong choices. So all those rating and labeling programs, the public information, education and training in general, to make everyone understand the implications of their choices, the climate or other sustainable development implications of their choices, is absolutely essential. And then we have the good old command and control regulations, where we have performance standards, technology standards, really telling how much a car can emit, what is the maximum ceiling, what can come out through its pipes. And again, that's clearly an area where we could have and should have done more. But again, because we are humans and we are prone to, I guess, industrial lobbying, laziness, or not really facing the consequences of our actions, for example, we have managed to not put the automotive sector under immense pressure to actually come up with other solutions than internal combustion engines. And these are really the angles what we all need to look at. And these four, as you see in the middle, are inherently interconnected. And that's a little bit, let me talk about a little bit about these interactions, on how this coexistence and interaction has always been the case. Sometimes we don't understand them, but they do exist. So just using a few probably very well-known examples. Renewables, and I think let me take Germany's example on that, were absolutely required to come up with these new technologies. But obviously, it then coincided and ran parallel with the emission trading system, sometimes really creating some very strange interactions, and sometimes even becoming ineffective, because if you have a ceiling on emissions, such as in an emission trading system, then you may not spend extra money on particular renewable targets, because you would reach those targets through one instrument, which is putting a price on carbon and making those renewables actually a wise and high return investment. Obviously, you would have the way how revenues from carbon pricing are being used. Is it something which would end up in the general budget, and when you cannot really figure out what the impact is, or you really go after particular emission reductions, either in covered or in not tax or emission trading covered systems. And then you would also have those very positive interactions when you would set another regulation, let's say, and again, I used the Chinese air quality examples. You set air quality standards in order to protect your population from ambient air and air pollution, and you discover that actually that drives emissions down very simply because the same chimneys which would emit that particular matter what you regulate are the ones which are used for fossil-based electricity generation. And obviously the list is endless. You can really come up with your own examples easily. But again, taking one step back and then recognizing how carbon pricing are related to other instruments which we have in our hands, what we use for our regulations, it's really good to see that from an economic perspective, you can really see CO2 emissions as the energy intensity multiplied by the carbon intensity. You know, the more energy you use, or the more energy per unit of GDP you require, and the more carbon intensive that energy source is, you would end up with larger emissions. And then the little pictograms shows how, by intervening in these particular fields, you would actually impact on the CO2 emissions. You would pick renewable support, and that is inherently influencing CO2 emissions, what you are trying to influence by a carbon price. If that is the case, and that's logical, or if you promote fuel switch, if you promote electric cars, which both use electricity, which use electricity instead of fossil fuels, that would influence the overall system value. So by looking at the complexities from this angle, you would immediately discover that you can't focus on a single carbon price as a standalone element. You really need to look at and consider all these other instruments and see their combined impact on the CO2 emissions, and obviously on all the other policy measures what you want to deal with. And this is really the point where, again, the conceptual, the policy mix really becomes a stepwise exercise, so to say. If you look at policies which are unlocking, for example, cost-effective energy efficiency, and energy efficiency has been a huge problem. We simply don't care how much we pay for energy, and that's wrong, but that's the way, that's the human way. So if you start introducing energy performance standards for appliances, which you would use anyway because it's in your kitchen, or it's your television or monitor what you follow me on, then you would be able to look at very cost-effective emission reductions. You don't need and you wouldn't impact on this through pricing carbon. You really need to set minimum energy performance standards for appliances in order to reach these, and then you will discover that with that you would have actually negative costs. This is making money by buying an energy efficient LED monitor as compared to an older type energy consuming equipment. Then obviously we do have the elements where the carbon pricing modalities would really work with negative and positive, but not drastically high costs. And this is the taxing or the emission trading system, for example, set on the power sector. They are normally in this field and in this range, where even a modest carbon price make a difference in terms of switching between fuels and in terms of actually promoting renewable energy, which obviously has zero or very limited carbon emission. And then obviously you have the angle, the technology support policies, what we looked at earlier, when it comes to the long-term decarbonization cost. Something which costs prohibitively high at this particular moment cannot really be driven and supported by an emission trading system. Very simply because that price range is not reaching the level what is required to make these technological solutions accessible or being produced on a large scale, in order to push them through that early lifestyle, in order to get them to the level when their prices would be in an affordable range. You need these technology support policies. Again, Germany is a great example of how their technology support policies led to improvements in solar PV and in wind power to reach the present stage when these are competitive. Had they not put the money, the technology support measures 10, 15, 20 years ago into these sectors, we would be still without those PV and wind energy solutions. And this is something that, again, always needs to be kept in mind. When you look at a particular potential for emission reduction, and you will find that it is somewhere in the extreme, either it is something which should have happened, sorry, already, but it hasn't, and energy efficiency is a clear example, or something which requires technology support interventions. You need to think outside of the box. Sorry, just a second. Apologies, I had either a cold or perhaps Omicron and COVID is just in my throat, so I'm sorry. So when we look at this can really be converted into conceptually into the question on how and when we use carbon pricing. And this is really, really intriguing, because it turns out that in the short term, we really have the impacts of optimizing existing technologies and infrastructure. How the existing infrastructure is used could really be influenced by this. The emission trading system of Europe is a very clear example. It really created a major move away from coal to gas, from a very heavy, very carbon-intensive fuel to a less carbon-intensive fuel. On some occasions, at the same plants, actually making relatively cheap, relatively minimal transformations, or on some occasions in the electricity sector, it's really, really the merit order. It's really which plant you switch on to provide electricity at a particular time. And again, gas also had this advantage of being able to be switched on and off very quickly, as what even run as spinning reserve, whilst obviously a coal plant is a little bit more sluggish in terms of its reaction. But this is really in the short term. In the medium to long term, carbon pricing really, really helps to think of all those options which are out there into which you could actually move, provided someone, for example, support those infrastructure investments. Someone would, for example, create the connection to offshore wind. The wind itself could be already competitive with such a price, but then someone really needs to support the infrastructure to get that particular connection, and then it could work. And again, this price discovery really, really helps of actually changing and helping countries to make large infrastructure adjustments and infrastructure decisions. And then you have the long-term impact, in which the supportive role is there, but we already know, and that is what we discussed by looking at the right side of the previous picture, that it is simply not sufficient. We also need to get those other angles with the other mechanisms, and obviously we really need to get the full set of the machinery of policies and measures to make changes. So I guess in summing up, in the short and medium term, carbon pricing makes a big difference, and for the long term it plays a role. But again, you would also argue that when we will be very close to zero emissions, then the pricing that very little emission may have or should have a far smaller role. Carbon pricing is something which eventually would die. As soon as we reach carbon neutrality, the carbon pricing will no longer be a tool. So actually we are designing something which is by definition transitory in its nature. it only works, and it should work at the time when we have emissions to deal with. So the interactions which I mentioned in this sea of complexity, what you brought up on the screen by naming all those elements. I think it's a typology always helps to get a sort of mental picture. And this is where we have complementary policies. And this is really the point where, we are combining policy tools and they will all point into one direction. Then we have the overlapping policies and renewable support in order to get renewables being built, and carbon pricing is something where you have an overlapping policy. It basically deals with the same impact or the same direction, but provides perhaps unnecessary triggers, or actually doesn't provide triggers because someone has already done your job with another instrument. And then the most painful one, when we have instruments which are actually weakening the carbon price signal. So on one hand, we are working on building an effective, meaningful system with a carbon price through emission trading or a tax scheme, which would make things in the right direction. But someone else, somewhere in the government, in another part of the government, is busy doing something which undermines all of our efforts, and the end result would be really, really shameful. So a handful of examples again. Complementary policies on the energy markets. This is something where energy access and affordability could really, really be supported in a way that it considers these angles, and sometimes off-grid energy could only be PV. So you do have those angles where this is rather evident. We have land use, and that's also an area where we could have contradicting policies, and also we have some controversy, whether we look at carbon sequestration increases, which is an easy to judge thing. It's definitely on the good side, although you can mess it up with non-native species or invasive species and so on. But we also have bioenergy use, which can get a very tricky field, whereby producing renewable energy, but then undermining biodiversity or even causing air pollution. Then we have finance, and that's really, really the issue where the EU is again providing a lot of very valuable experiences by creating the first compulsory green taxonomy. So it's no longer the decision of anybody saying that, well, what I do is green, is sustainable, but really, really making sure that there is a strict taxonomy under which you call yourself green, then everyone can be certain that it moves in the right direction. And it sets thresholds, values for emissions. It really, really looks at environmental impacts as well in an incorporated and integrated manner. And then we have infrastructure, where combining resilient infrastructure, which builds in the preparations for future climate change, and access to other elements of enabling policies for building renewable power plants is absolutely essential. Then we have overlapping policies, and this is really the point where I guess we all know the saying that the road to hell is paved with goodwill, where we do have all the goodwill of supporting all sorts of good things which would save us from the climate crisis, but then actually we end up with a suboptimal choice. And renewable support policies, again, which came in parallel or even earlier than emission reduction policies, are very, very good examples. Again, there could be very strong examples and arguments for keeping these mechanism alive in order to address this discrepancy between the short and the long term, and arguing that long-term innovative solutions and industrial decarbonization in hard to abate industrial sectors really requires this. Plus, obviously, this could be the very long-term impact, where the time frame of the carbon pricing may not be long enough for investors to engage. And then the very painful bit, coming back to these elements which could kill our efforts. The fossil fuel subsidies is really the point which is hard to comprehend, how for years of promises we are still in the hundreds of billions. We are still pouring oil literally on the fire, whilst we are trying to get moving money in the right direction as well. Again, you can also ask the question that direct fossil subsidies, which are of monetary nature, which are paid literally by your budget, could not be paid in another direction. Or what happens if your carbon pricing revenues are used for fossil fuel subsidies in a budget where your carbon revenues are not earmarked, and where it's possible that your revenues from carbon pricing actually rechannel towards fossil fuel subsidies. The angle, which is also very painful, and I think I alluded to it earlier, what happens if we have regulations which does not allow that carbon price to make its impact? If it's hidden, if price regulations of household energy, for example, actually hide that carbon cost. It's there, but it does not really gives a signal, perhaps to move away from particular more carbon intensive sources. And then we again know that exemptions are always there. The EU emission trading system is again no exemption from that, on how particular industries manage to negotiate themselves out of the industry based on various very smart arguments on being very costly to measure the emissions, having major export markets they didn't want to lose, not getting ready with their technologies for emission reductions, being too small to have a cost-effective way of measuring emissions. So then we do have a few examples, but due to the sake of time, I would only bring up a few, but you would be able to look at them in the slides. And then really coming to the pretty much the closing conceptual elements. And this is, again, I think, absolutely essential when you argue for placing carbon pricing to the core. And again, we do have a good example of the European Union, which put carbon pricing into the core, and it has become a flagship instrument in the climate policy mix. It's really the central driver of climate action. Obviously, if you have 55% of your emissions covered by an emission trading scheme, and that is increasing by adding additional sectors, and you build your system around it with other measures in the non-covered sectors, this is a policy choice. But you can also look at carbon pricing as a supporting a tool where you actually build your system around other measures. But in that case, it could serve, and it would serve as a safety net. So the bottom line is that you would not work without carbon pricing in the future. Anyone who argues that carbon pricing is ineffective, carbon pricing should not be placed in your policy mix, can really be refuted by this argument and by these examples. So when you have the flagship, the argument that let's put put a price on carbon argument into the middle, and you build your systems around it, when you have obviously industries and major fossil energy generation, then this would really work. But then obviously you really have the core angle of having predictability in terms of achieving the goals in the long term. And no matter whether this predictability is a tax, where the calculation of the impacts is a bit more complicated, but it's still possible, or it's an emission trading system. But obviously, you need to consider all the other market failures, because there are plenty of them in designing your system. And you always need to recognize that carbon pricing is limited to some extent, and you will have particular areas, emitting areas of the economy, which are not covered. When it comes to the safety net approach, you really need to get a framing, so to say, on how you put and how you decarbonize your economy on a price basis, but then you would have other drivers. And this is a policy choice. It's really, really up to a country to decide. I think what I have spoken about today clearly shows that there are very, very strong arguments why you put carbon pricing into the core of your economic regulations. And that's, if you look at, again, recalling how the ETS and the carbon taxes are different if they are put into the core, and that's the the level of detail which I should skip in order to stay within time. But then I want to give you a sort of rather visual example on the interconnectedness using emission trading as an example, and something which is called the waterbed effect, which I think you can think about. If you jump into a waterbed, one part goes down, but the other part really goes up. And this is really an issue which needs to be calculated, incorporated into your thinking when you design a system. So just imagine that you are fixing the emissions through an emission trading system cap. Again, you have that ceiling, that very strong ceilings, what you cannot go further, and you look at it from a particular emitter, an industrial installation. You really set that target, and then you ask that why on earth I have other instruments addressing the very same installation and telling them to emit less if you have that ceiling. That's, this is really the point when you recognize that indeed you may not put extra efforts to anything else if you have that ceiling and it works seriously. So if you have that complementary policies set and then they don't deliver any additional benefits, then you say, hold on, let me just stick to the emission trading system. And then moving to the angle of how to finally conclude how to align all these issues and how to come up with a solution which incorporates all these views, again, what you put up so wisely on your word collection screen. So there are some fundamental rules that there must be a recognition that all the governments have competing objectives. It's a multiple set of objectives within which climate action is one, and that is fact of life. Then we also need to sort of accept that there is an evolution of policies and measures, and there is an evolution of needs which are always changing over time, in which there is a particular dynamism what we need to look at. And then if we use this careful policy mapping analytical tools of really exploring these interactions in advance, then we would achieve far better than if we are trying to analyze complexities looking backwards. So we have complementary instruments, and these are the issues which we need to look at first. And that's really the angle where we must see the limitations of carbon pricing. There are elements which cannot be addressed by carbon pricing. And let me give you a few examples. If a particular sector doesn't require to pricing because it's difficult to monitor, agriculture is a good example. There you really can't deal with this. We have long-term imposes for innovations and technology support, where we discuss that carbon pricing is not enough in the long term to reach and to instigate those actions what we will require. Then we have areas where we as regulators, again putting up a government hat, you have other means. If you are able to move if you are able to create infrastructure, for example, which changes the attractiveness of road transport versus rail transport or urban transportation, and people are happy to jump onto a train because that is faster and it exists, and they don't need to use their own private means of transportations or individual vehicles, then this would help. Again, if you don't have the infrastructure, then it doesn't happen. A car will not be abandoned until you have an alternative. A car can be replaced by an electric car, but certainly it will not be abandoned until you have an alternative method. And that's not carbon pricing. That's developing a climate-friendly and climate-resilient transport infrastructure. And then you have the complementarity of looking at telling a particular sector how you would change, and then really having the heavy machinery of all those elements created. The power sector is a good example. You need to cut back on coal. You may promote coal to gas or coal to gas biomass conversions, but you also support renewables. And the overall need to provide you the electricity, what you need, in the safe way, what you require, and at cost levels, what is affordable. With overlapping policies, the basic rule is simple. You try to minimize the overlaps, and you do that by enhancing coordination. You really thinking hard on how and what rationale is being used, and you evaluate what is more effective, and then you choose from these competing policies what would work best. And then when it comes to the countervailing or really conflictual policies, you really need to explore and you really need to expose them, and then hopefully policymakers are acting on this. An example from Mexico, which clearly shows how the enthusiasm of introducing all sorts of instruments could end up in multiple instruments coming on board at the same time, although all of them negotiated down, so to say, to a level which perhaps makes relatively little impact. But again, you compare to nothing, and you incorporate the benefits of learning from both, and then you say that yes, they need to review these mechanisms, the carbon tax combined with the emission trading systems, sometimes with overlapping sectors, and then you can move ahead. Again, you ask the question that do you really need to make such a learning complexity or mess in order to improve those systems? Probably the answer is no, but I guess we should accept the fact that doing things is always better than not doing them, or contemplating forever because it's so complex that we cannot make up our minds. The Mexicans moved into action. They created overlapping and sometimes not really harmonized systems on which I'm just hopeful that they will quickly reflect on these lessons and move ahead and adjust their systems. So I think as we are really running out of time, I just have the policy interactions management tool set very briefly. Again, these are rather evidently flowing from what I have said before on how you build on what you have and what others have done, how you always evaluate the impacts. You don't do policies without impact assessment. You then set your ETS or tax rate, again modeling how they will impact, and then you build in the learning cycle. You don't say that you have created the most perfect system because you learn from all people all around the world, so this is then perfect at the start. Nothing is perfect at the start. You build in these learning cycles and you improve your systems over time. Again, a few more very intriguing case studies on those entities, and California is a good example, which came up as a very rich country with an extremely complex and complicated system, which appears to be delivered. But it also clearly shows the message that you really calculate the impacts. You really come up with those various instruments. You see it on the left-hand side of how the various regulations would impact on emissions. And then you would know, and then obviously you compare it to realities, and then you adjust your points. So the key takeaways for today, and with that I will conclude, but I would allow questions to be raised, that carbon pricing is indeed efficient in our bigger, broader policy toolbox, but it's not the only instrument. We really have the full set, and we always need to see how these are interconnected. Interactions and overlaps is common, and they must be managed. They must be managed upfront. We really have coherence and complementary policies, and that would build something which goes in one direction. But we really need to know that certainly we do have overlaps, and we have countervailing, contradicting policies, which we need to watch out from the start. We just can't pretend that we are coming from a vacuum. These rules, what you are going to implement in carbon pricing, would really be in a complex setup. And with that, I would like to conclude and would allow a few questions and comments to be raised.
Thanks, Zot. I think we have a couple of questions. We can take one or two, and I would advise that possibly we can answer them either in writing or tomorrow as part of the recap session. We can also address these questions. So if there are any questions that the participants would like to answer, get answered directly, please raise your hands and we will unmute you to answer these questions. If not, Zot, there are a couple of questions in the Q&A box. If you, because there are multiple questions, would you like to take one of them and just address that?
Yes, absolutely. And this is something, yeah, I also spotted a few in the chat box, and yeah, and I see the ones on the screen. Hold on one second. Is there any particular one which you have already found intriguing, because I guess we would certainly not have time for the 12. Is there any one what you think would be just the best one to start with? I think I have one, and this is really the issue of which we haven't covered today from the international perspective, and I think it's absolutely fundamental. It's really the equity and climate justice aspects from Arun Pojari, and sorry for mispronouncing your name, and this is indeed an angle where it appears that we tend to focus on the remaining carbon budget. I mean, this is what I did today, haven't I? But then obviously you ask the question of, how you distribute that remaining carbon budget, which I guess is the core climate justice question, in which I think the very simple answer is that, where I am speaking, we should already be zero emitting, but we are not, whilst obviously others who have not emitted anything at all on a per capita or on a historical basis should be given a longer time frame to reach those net zero. Again, to some extent, this is reflected with the 2060, 2070 target dates, but I would still argue that that's again unfair, or easily can be seen unfair if we are looking at for the developed countries 2050. But that's really the point whereby you look at present day emissions. You say when you want to achieve a particular target, which then defines your linear or non-linear reduction target for each of the coming years. So technically, but that's obviously not the way how the Paris Agreement is structured, if we are able to come to an agreement globally on who is reaching zero by when, and that defines those particular pathways, then this would actually be translated into an emission trading scheme target, which then, depending on how steep that curve is in the emission reductions, would result in different prices. I think to some extent this is hopefully an answer on coming up with a system or with a solution which reflects this differentiation between countries, between the historic responsibilities for emissions, but it really implies the slicing up of the remaining carbon budget and distributing it between countries, which is apparently not the way how the international community is looking at action, with the bottom-up and non-prescriptive way of the Paris Agreement. But even if we decide, if that 450 is allocated between countries and then allocated for those sectors which can be regulated by an emission trading system, that does not take into account the historic emissions. If the allocation of the carbon budget is based on the historic responsibilities for emission reductions, then we would be able to come up at the end of the road with an emission trading system which would reflect those climate justice driven values. But certainly that, I don't think that is a political reality. What worries me is that we would all be telling to ourselves and to others that we are doing as a country the utmost, we are doing better than all the others. And then on the basis of that, for example, we introduce our own carbon pricing, be it an emission trading system, be it a carbon tax, saying that with that, we reach the goals, what are fair, what are based on justice, what are based on equity. But if we are in such a system, then we would never reach net zero, because we would have the typical free riding problem of climate change, within which we always wait for others to act. Just imagine you are invited to a dinner, everyone turns up, and we all believe that someone else will bring the food, but none of us will bring the food. We will be hungry, and we will be angry as well, and we will do something. With climate change, with the global regulations really not being able to address that distributional issue of who is allowed to emit what, we are facing a major trouble. And I think with that, I am showing how, in principle, if the target is strict enough and that is justified by climate justice and equity, then that would be converted into different emission reduction pathways and the differently deep slide, and then that would work. But then that is not likely to happen, and that's really the huge equity challenge across the globe. You can also look at it within a country, but I think most importantly, the question was really related on how and why an Indian who is emitting 1.6 ton per person now, and its historic emissions is just far slower and incomparable to the historic emissions of the developed world. And that's an angle which is yet to be incorporated into today's regulations. And it's very clear that what we are looking at is a very unfair and unjust and unequitable system on the global scale, for which we offer effective tools, but we are not really addressing this fundamental equity problem. I hope that this gave an answer, although not a very happy answer to this question.
Thank you. We have actually reached almost 10 minutes beyond our scheduled time. However, this has been a great lesson that we've learned today, and almost like we're going back into the classroom. I think for today, we can close the session, and we will address your questions, possibly in writing, or tomorrow, as well as a collective. We will address any issues that you have or clarifications on the subject. We also have a feedback form for you today, in which you can mention whether you have any questions relating to the subject or in terms of organization as well. So please do fill up the form, as it will help us for the next 2 sessions as well. So thank you very much for today, and we look forward to having you tomorrow, same time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I promise
Thanks.
tomorrow we are really moving towards more practical issues. So if you feel that this is too much, it's too high, it's too helicopter, it's too much economics and rules, we are really moving to the nitty-gritty of the project mechanism established by the Paris Agreement, and perhaps that will be more comprehensible and closer to your hearts, and definitely to your everyday actions. Well, thank you very much for the attendance, and obviously do drop us questions what we can handle and incorporate, and see you tomorrow.